Hello, welcome to This Week's World. Is the party over? Why the world may never get rich again. We hear from the former US Treasury Secretary who thinks global growth has gone for good. We'll meet the Brazilians who bet their futures on a boom. Now their town is bust. We devote this programme to one big idea, that after the crash, everything would eventually get back to normal. What if that's wrong and the economy has changed forever? Before we get down to work, we're going to chat through a few of the stories that have been making waves. My city of the week is Berlin. The German capital has passed a law banning Airbnb from operating there. Why? Well, the authorities say that the disruptive technology firm, which encourages people to let out their homes, is actually making Germany's housing shortage even worse. Being German, of course, they even have a special word for the new law. It's You can read that yourself. Joining me this week, Rosalind Warren of BuzzFeed News and Amal Rajan, editor-at-large of The Independent. Very nice to have you both here.
Nice to see
and
you.
We're going to kick off with Close Encounter of the Week. Amal, over to you.
Yeah, well, this was an amazing and much awaited encounter between Megyn Kelly and Donald Trump in America. So you'll remember that last August, during the presidential debates, the Republican primaries, Megyn Kelly was the host of Fox News and asked Donald Trump a slightly different question.
You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals.
And Megyn Kelly's been chasing an interview with Donald Trump for a very, very long time. And this week, finally, 2 weeks after it was initially recorded, there was this famous broadcast. And I think that was weird about it was it's obvious that Donald Trump is going after the female vote. So he's got a big problem where Hillary Clinton's way ahead with women voters, and Donald Trump desperately needs to claw back some ground. But this was a different kind of Donald Trump. This was a softer, more feeling, more kind of emotional Donald Trump. He was asked at one point by Megyn Kelly why he'd retweeted the assertion that she was a bimbo. And he sort of played dumb. And, yeah, Donald Trump doesn't often play dumb, but he kind of went, oh, was that me? Did I really do that?
He denied that he ever called her a bimbo.
He actually sort of denied doing that. So this is the evolution of Donald Trump from candidate to really quite serious potential presidential contender. And I think this is probably the week where we have to start saying, you know, this guy's serious. You know, all around the world we're seeing these big machismo characters coming to power. And actually, maybe we need to start thinking that Donald Trump could actually win.
That's a thought and a half. Rosalind, take us to, we're going to call yours Conspiracy of the Week. I love this one.
So, yeah, it's an incredibly bizarre story to come out of Iran at the moment. So, in recent weeks, there's been a crackdown of Instagram models and fashion photographers and designers. And a few of them have been arrested in the last couple of days. The reason it sort of stands out is it's the first time that they've, actively sought after influential people online and on social media. And so Instagram stars have been sort of targeted. But the sort of bizarre turn in the last day or so that's really stood out is that the Iranian authorities are now saying that Kim Kardashian is part of some plot with Instagram to influence the culture in Iran and for, going against essentially what, they want.
Is there a fear, do you think, there? I mean, is it a tangible fear or...?
It's unlike anything that's ever happened before. You know, people are very critical of Kim Kardashian and popular culture, but this is the first time I think a government has sort of actively said, she is a threat to our society.
One of the most extraordinary stories of the week, we're going to call it, I guess, long overdue rescue of the week, was what happened in Nigeria.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago there was a very widely reported incident where Boko Haram, who are this really, really nasty Islamist radicals in northern Nigeria, went into a school and kidnapped about nearly 300 girls. 50 of them escaped, but 219 were taken into hiding and, as far as we know, treated appallingly, raped and tortured and all that kind of thing. This week, there was a wonderful story of one of the girls escaped. We don't quite know how exactly, but it's the first sign of a kind of a vulnerability of Boko Haram. It's the first sign that one of them might actually be able to get away. Yeah. Interestingly, she's met this week with Buhari, who's the new president of Nigeria. And it's a really interesting thing going on, which is that Buhari came to power last year succeeding Goodluck Jonathan, who is widely thought of as a pretty weak and ineffectual leader. And all around the world, we're seeing, as I mentioned with Trump, this real machismo, this kind of strongman politics, where people are looking for strong leadership to hold countries together. Nigeria is one of the most important countries in Africa. It's the biggest population, the biggest economy, and it's kind of disintegrating, splitting into two between an Islamic north and a Christian south. Buhari has got this incredibly important job to try and stop Africa's biggest and most important country splitting up, and I'm sure that he's going to use this interview or this meeting that he had, this well-publicised meeting he had with one of the Chibok girls as a way to try to mobilise popular support to say, let's take the fight to Boko Haram.
Talking about popular support in a very different way, you're going to tell us about the sharp elbow of the week.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Yeah, Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, who, you know, in the public eye especially in the last year or so, he's sort of kind of shot out of nowhere, and he became hugely popular for being very progressive as a leader. Recently kicked up a fuss because in Parliament he was rushing over to an aide and accidentally, well, he claims accidentally knocked a female politician with his elbow while he was trying to grab this other person in Parliament to drag him over to another part of Parliament. And it sort of kicked up a fuss where people, you know, publicly then, you know, called him out on Twitter and were saying, you know, this is completely unacceptable for someone who...
Does it feel like the honeymoon is over? Is that a
I think there's a lot of people that want to knock down Justin Trudeau a peg or two. He's a good-looking guy, poses naked, glamorous family, speaks several languages, all that sort of stuff. And I think this is a lot of people who are out to sort of get him. And there's a lot of people... Because he's one of the few politicians around the world at the moment who's sort of notably centre-left. You know, the centre-left's having a bad time around the world. So there's a lot of people that want to take him down. And you should have seen the apology that he gave this week in Parliament. He looked like he was a toddler that was going to cry.
I would like to take a moment to apologise.
Apologise.
I apologise to the member and to all parliamentarians.
He sort of said, I am so sorry.
Yeah,
if I hurt anyone,
in the background.
I didn't mean, if I impacted anyone, I'm so sorry. So there was a kind of vulnerability there, which maybe Donald Trump could learn a thing or two from.
Take a note, perhaps.
Take a note.
Thank you both very much indeed. So on to this big idea then. You may not have heard the phrase secular stagnation. We hadn't until this programme. But it's the one some economists are using to describe that however hard you work, you may barely get any richer.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
For decades now, politicians have been able to tell us we're getting richer. A whole world becoming homeowners, car owners, holiday makers. They've been able to promise this because globally, the economic growth rate seemed to be on an ever upward trajectory. Everything the world powers did after the 2008 crash, the bailouts and the stimulus and the quantitative easing were based on the assumption that growth would return.
Extra growth, extra jobs.
A new foundation for growth.
Growth we pursue.
8 years on, the rate of growth continues to disappoint, falling well below what our politicians told us to expect. Many fear that something has permanently shifted in the underlying economy. But what could that be? Well, one man is associated with that phrase, secular stagnation, more than anyone else. He's Larry Summers, former US Treasury Secretary, who worked for Bill Clinton, advised Obama too. Secular in this context means permanent or chronic. So does he think the world economy has fundamentally changed?
Globally, we've had for some substantial time a chronic excess of desired saving over desired investment. That means more funds being supplied than are demanded. That means extremely low interest rates. It means a tendency towards slow growth. It means those periods when the economy grows reasonably well are periods of very large credit expansion supported by low interest rates that raise challenges for financial stability down the road.
Secular, essentially, in this context means ongoing or permanent. How long do you think this will last?
I think this is with us for the foreseeable future. And there's been consistent disappointment about the recovery. And it's been quite a long time globally since we've had good growth with a sustainable and sound foundation.
Do you feel that the US is close to recession again?
No, I think that would be too strong a statement right now, but I do think the odds are better than 50-50 that the U.S. will have a recession within the next 3 years. And I think when that happens, if that happens, there won't be anything like the normal capacity for monetary response. Traditionally, in U.S. recessions, interest rates have fallen by 400 basis points. There's very unlikely to be anything like that much room to bring down interest rates. And that means we're going to have to do things in a different way.
If I asked you for the chances when you're talking about the UK or about Europe, would you put it roughly the same?
In the same general range. I don't want to make a specific, assign a specific probability, but a thing we always have to keep in mind is that not a single recession has been forecast a year in advance by much of anybody, not the IMF, not the US Federal Reserve, not the Bank of England. And so the fact that we don't see recession forecasts right now doesn't mean that there isn't a reasonable chance of recession.
And do you think there is anything in the kind of politics we're seeing in the US right now that proves your point?
I think the slowdown and the frustration and the lack of opportunity that a weak economy has for a large number of people is driving politics in many places. It's driving the Brexit movement in the United Kingdom. It's driving the rise of Ms. Le Pen in France. And I think it's got a great deal to do with Donald Trump's ascendancy in the Republican Party in the United States.
So we've tried quantitative easing and it hasn't done the trick entirely. We've tried low interest rates and that hasn't done the trick entirely. Do we need a new tool to actually kickstart the economy and growth? And what is that?
I think we need much more reliance and recognition of the role of fiscal policy in economic stabilization. That means a willingness, particularly in countries like mine, where public investment has lagged badly, to invest substantially in maintaining the existing infrastructure and creating new infrastructure that puts people to work in the short run, that expands capacity in the medium run, and it removes the terrible deficit burden that is represented by deferred maintenance in the long run.
But we've seen massive stimulus packages under the Obama administration. We know that when you spend money, you get countries into higher debt. That can't be the solution.
Well, you say that, but in fact, if you look, the Obama administration did engage in large-scale spending in its first 2 years, and you saw the sharpest V, the sharpest move from contraction to expansion in the post-war history of the United States. Then, under congressional pressure, there was a shift back to austerity in 2011, at which point results in the economy became very substantially mediocre.
Professor Summers, thank you. So an economist explains it by looking at saving and investment. But what if there's an even more radical idea? Have we given up on evolution by simply not having enough babies? The rate of population growth has slowed dramatically. Is the workforce now becoming too small? After the crash of 2008, the developed world looked towards the new kids on the block, the so-called BRICS economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. We hoped they would bring the developed world up, but perhaps the opposite happened. This week's World has been to Itaboraí, outside Rio. It once saw itself as the heart of Brazil's economic revolution. But look what happened.
Ele era inicialmente um mega projeto, né, que é um complexo petroquímico, onde seria gerar 226 mil empregos, maior do que a nossa população.
O Complexo de Itaboraí era um local onde que todos nós soldadores, todo o pessoal da metalurgia queria trabalhar. Era uma euforia, era maravilhoso.
Movimentou a cidade num todo. A população em si aumentou muitíssimo, investido muito na questão da construção. Então foi um sonho para qualquer brasileiro vir para nossa cidade. Mas só que esses sonhos caíram por terra. Meu nome é Sérgio, eu sou lixador e soldador. Eu entrei no Complexo Petroquímico de Itaboraí em 2012. Houve a nossa dispensa em 2015, né? Despesa com 2 filhos pequenos, com esposa, então a despesa é muito alta, então você não pode ficar parado. Quase todos os dias nós vamos na agência para ver se há alguma vaga de emprego, porque a gente tem que fazer alguma coisa para sustentar a família. Você tenta entrar no mercado, mas as portas todas estão fechadas. Tem muita gente hoje dentro de Itaboraí que são de outros estados que não conseguiram retornar para os seus estados porque não tem condições.
Dei 2 anos, curso PIT, curso técnico, sou top rosa e nem vaga de ajudante tem.
Estamos aqui na agência de emprego, né? E olhando para aquele lado nós conseguimos enxergar um dos maiores prédios de Itaboraí. É um empreendimento muito grande, tem até heliporto e continua vazio.
Meu nome é Elio Barreto Cardoso, prefeito municipal da cidade. Aqui nós estamos no heliponto, aonde chegaria toda hora, a todo momento, grandes executivos do mundo inteiro, e isso não acontece. O prédio está todo fechado, coisa que representava o grande futuro da cidade, né? E hoje os prédios todos fechados. Esse sonho que virou um grande pesadelo para a cidade. Você sente uma tristeza no olhar das pessoas, ao mesmo tempo você sente um equilíbrio muito forte dessas pessoas.
Meu nome é Cássia Gonçalves Moreira. Aqui sou eu soldando uma tubulação da Comperge. Na realidade, solda vicia. A solda é uma coisa do coração da gente, né? A nossa empresa, ela sumiu, entendeu? E eu lembrei que minha mãe fazia empada lá na praia, no Espírito Santo. Eu e minha família, hoje a gente sobrevive graças ao trabalho das empadinhas.
Ei, vou lá, meu filhão. Como já corri de manhã cedo na empresa qual eles oferecem a vaga, não consegui, agora eu vou retornar aqui à casa para mim estar fazendo a manutenção de pintura e emassar a casa. No mercado de emprego você não consegue nenhum tipo de vaga para você trabalhar de carteira assinada. Então você tem que procurar alguma coisa para você fazer, para você sustentar a sua família. Essa desaceleração no mercado mundial, eu acho que trouxe muito malefício, no caso também, para os sonhos nossos aqui. A gente não consegue enxergar um futuro, porque está tudo parado. A gente fica pensando como a gente vai recomeçar.
Well, let's get the view of the BRICS and of Europe about that idea that growth has slowed for good. With me now, Jean-Claude Trichet, the former head of the European Central Bank, who managed to keep the Eurozone afloat during the crisis, and Tito Mbweni, the man responsible for rebuilding the South African economy after apartheid. Many thanks to you both for joining us. Jean-Claude Trichet, do you agree with Larry Summers that we are now in an era of permanent low growth?
I partly agree and partly disagree. I consider that it is true that the aging of the population all over the world, and particularly, of course, in the advanced economy, is a factor which is adverse in terms of growth, very adverse, obviously. On the other hand, it is also true that the kind of growth that we had during the previous period before the crisis was partly artificial and partly based on a very high level of over-indebtedness. And that's the reason why we had the crisis. So if you take those two elements, you can explain why we should expect medium and long-term growth inferior to what we had observed in this bright period before the crisis.
Tito Mbweni, is that right now, that essentially we have to wave goodbye to this idea of ever coming back to pre-crisis levels?
In the first instance, I don't agree that there's anything permanent about the current low growth, low inflation, and low interest rate environment. But I think that the idea that central banks are the only ones who are capable of uplifting the global economy once again is wrong. I think we must now put the responsibility squarely on the part of governments to do their bit in terms of structural reforms, which are necessary to get us from where we are now and no longer rely on central banks and cheap money. And I think if the governments of Europe in particular and the United States could take on structural reforms, we could get out of this situation much sooner than we think.
What do you say to that, Jean-Claude Trichet, that the central banks can't manage this problem?
In a way, I fully agree with Tito that if we could embark on active structural reforms, we would certainly elevate the growth potential. Also, I have to say, I am convinced that IT, science and technology, and the immense progress that we are making presently are also something which is positive for total productivity, and I'm sure that we will see this materializing in the years to come. So, as you see, I'm more optimistic, much more optimistic than Larry, still, of course, depending on the structural reforms, and Tito has a point there.
Tito Mbweni, do you think that quantitative easing, this increasing the supply of money, is working?
Well, there was a period during which the quantitative easing strategies were working for a while. And I think it has done its bit. And now we're getting to negative banking rates. Now that is very dangerous because it is going to bring about new structural impediments within the banking systems.
Mr. Trichet, the point has been made that one thing that started as an extraordinary measure now seems commonplace. Do you think that authorities have run out of tools, that none of the ordinary tools are working anymore to kickstart the economy?
First of all, we have to recognize that the measures that are taken and maintained today are absolutely extraordinary. But that doesn't mean that they are wrong, because the counterfactual would probably be that the situation would be much worse.
Do you sense, for example, in Europe, that Brexit would make any difference to Europe's growth?
Well, I think first, Brexit would make an enormous difference for the UK, because the losses are gigantic if the UK decides to leave, not only economically and financially, but also even politically, because perhaps part of the UK would decide to leave. So again, I'm in a full agreement with Mark Carney, with Gordon Brown, with the UK Prime Minister, of course, when they say, but we must stay, we must stay.
You don't think it's wrong for a central banker like Mark Carney to step into a political row?
No, I think that central banks, as I said, have to tell what they see. They should not and are not substituting to governments, parliaments, and the private sector, but there is an obligation, it seems to me, in the present situation, which is extremely grave in all advanced economies and in the global economy as a whole, for the central bank to say candidly what they see.
Tito Mbweni, we talked a little bit about Europe. When you look at what's happening in Brazil and the BRICS, do you think that that era of growth, that expectation that was placed on the BRICS countries is now over, except for China?
Well, I don't think it's over yet. And I think that there's a lot that the BRICS countries can offer. They need to focus in particular on major infrastructure development programs that will facilitate further economic movement and development in their countries. They also must engage in structural reforms, labor reforms particularly as well as reforms in the education systems that must tie in with the new demands. So I have not given up yet on the growth coming from the BRICS countries. In fact, as part of our work in the BRICS Bank, about which I'm a director, we try and push very much the further development of these economies, investing in renewable energies and so forth. Let me just mention one thing that's very important in the conversation about structural reforms. One of the major structural reforms that must be undertaken and concluded is the world trade negotiations. Those negotiations must conclude. They are an important part of the structural overhang in the global economy.
And lastly, to you, Jean-Claude Trichet, do you think if we don't see growth return to the Eurozone in a big way, do you feel, as some commentators do, that the euro itself is in trouble?
No, first of all, of course, my working assumption is that growth is proceeding in Europe. Second, you might remember that in the first quarter of this year, we posted 0.5%, which was annualized a little more than what is given by the various financial institutions. So I take it that growth will progressively materialize. That depends on the structural reforms, that depends on appropriate management, appropriate governance. And I am, of course, calling permanently myself for more to be done in this respect.
Thank you both. That's it from this week's World. But this week, the actor Robin Wright revealed she threatened to go public about being paid less than Kevin Spacey in House of Cards. It worked. They're now paid the same. We caught up with another woman with another idea. She calls it the pay gap tax. Have a look.
All around the world, women are still getting paid less than men.
I got paid what?
Well, it's actually quite simple, I think. We introduce a pay gap tax. The pay gap tax is a tax that's paid to all the women in your company. Woohoo! By looking at the average amount that a man gets paid and the average amount that the woman gets paid, and that difference is paid to all the women in the company, regardless of performance, regardless of position. It gives companies an incentive to really solve the deeper issues that are at heart, that are to do with gender equality and diversity in the workplace.
But this is unfair on men, isn't it? Why are they getting a raise?
I definitely don't think it's unfair on men. Women have been facing issues for centuries. It's only now that people are starting to talk about how we can make the workplace a much more equal and safe and happy place.